Today, we want to think about how to design a diverse native grassland mix for grazing, specifically for the purpose of grazing. My name's Elizabeth Steele, and I work here at Hamilton Native Outpost. One of the things I do a lot of is design mixes, but then another thing that I'm involved with in my life is my husband and I run some livestock, both cattle and goats, and so I'm really passionate about diverse native grassland mixes for the purpose of grazing. There's two big concepts that I want to touch on when you're designing a diverse native grassland mix. And that is to get plenty of species from each functional diversity group. And then the second one is to make sure the plants that you plant are adapted to the site that you're planting them on. So if you pay attention to these things, you will end up with a lot more benefits from your diverse native grassland. So when I think of the benefits of a diverse native grassland, I really think of the benefits to the livestock. We can have green forage in each season, not just in one season. I think about the soil health benefits, the increased organic matter, the increased infiltration of rainfall into the soil, that water going into the soil. And I think of the wildlife, because good grazing management on a diverse native grassland can make some really good wildlife habitat. So back to the concept of what do we need to do to have a successful diverse native grassland planting. If we do these things well, to namely get our multiple species from each functional diversity group, and then also to have adapted plants, we're going to have a lot more of these benefits from our diverse native grassland. Okay, so first things first. A functional diversity group. What is a functional diversity group? I would say that this functional diversity group is a group of plants that has a certain function in the environment. And within that group, the function is very similar. So let's get an example. How about native warm season grasses? So we've got grasses. In other words, it's not a broadleaf plant, it's a grass, and it grows in the warm season. So this is a group of plants that all function fairly similarly. So an example of this would be big blue stem, eastern gamma grass, switchgrass, and there's plenty of them, but then some lesser known ones like purple top or beaked panic grass. Okay, so that's what a functional diversity group is, and that's one of them. So there's four of them that we often talk about here. One is the native warm season grasses, one is native cool season grasses, native forbs, and native legumes. So let's look at each of those real briefly. And then we'll talk about how many species we want to get in there from each group. Okay, so we touched on the warm season grasses, the native warm season grasses there a moment ago. And basically they love the high heat, the warm temperatures, they just thrive under that, and they're all grass or grass-like species. Native cool season grasses. Now these are lesser known than the warm season grasses, but they were a very important part of the grasslands that would have been here pre-settlement. So native cool season grasses love the nice cool temperatures of spring and fall. They love the good moisture that we generally have in these time frames, and they really thrive under that. And again, they're grasses, not broadleaf plants. Okay, then let's switch over to the broadleaf plants, so native forbs. Forbs is a fancy word for wildflowers, so there's lots of different things you can call them. And there's this huge diversity of forbs in our grasslands. The forbs are not what we generally think of in terms of putting in a pasture of a diverse native grassland. So why do you even want to include those broadleaf plants, those forbs, those wildflowers in a planting? I would say there's a couple reasons. One, many of them, now not all of them are palatable, but many of them are palatable and provide forage for the livestock. That's an important reason. Another reason is for the soil health benefits. And one last benefit is the wildlife benefits. Wildlife biologists have known for a long time that forbs are an important part of a planting for wildlife. So examples of native forbs would be coneflowers, blazing stars, and many, many other species of native wildflowers. Okay, native legumes, that's our fourth functional diversity group. This is really a subgroup of the native forbs, so it's a family of the forbs. And in agriculture, it really gets special notice because it is our source of free nitrogen fertilizer. The plants in this family have an association with a bacteria that lives on the root system of the plant. And basically that bacteria takes nitrogen from the air and gives it to the plant. In exchange, the plant gives food to that bacteria. So it's a symbiotic relationship where both organisms benefit. So we kind of put that into its own separate functional diversity group because of its importance in capturing that free nitrogen fertilizer for our native grasslands. There's quite a few different native legume species. Of course, in agriculture, we're much more familiar with the introduced legumes like the clovers or like the annual lespedeza, that sort of thing. But the purple well, there's two prairie clovers, the purple and the white are both very common, Illinois bundleflower, and many, many other native legumes. A diverse native grassland needs plants from each of these functional diversity groups to really be at its best, to be the best it can be. The next question is, how many plants do you want from each group? Is one native warm season, one native cool season, is that enough? One Forbs species, one legume, is that enough? I would suggest that that's not really the most ideal situation. There's no magic, but in general, more is better. Until a point. As with most things, you reach that point of diminishing returns where, you know, when you add the 100th one, you're not getting the same bang for your buck as you are when you add the 10th species. And so I want to explain why I believe that, because there's quite a few reasons that I think that's true. One that's really, really important to us in agriculture is stability. It doesn't matter how much forage you have in the really good years. What you're looking for is stable forage production from year to year so that you don't have this up and down where you're having to sell cows on the dry years. Rather, you can just, you know, keep chugging along at a pretty consistent level, keep your herd size very similar through the years because you have stability. So how does diversity and multiple species of each functional diversity group, how does that really serve to give us stability? I'll give you a couple examples that really make a lot of sense to me. One is the wild rice. So we have like 6 different wild rice species that we deal with, and maybe there's 8 or so in the state. I'd have to look, but basically there's like every 2 weeks there's another wild rye that is maturing and, you know, going through a certain part of its life cycle. So you take the earliest one, early wild rye. Early wild rye is really a great plant. Comes off early, is green, one of the earliest things to green up when you're coming out of winter. That's really valuable. And you're like, well, I'll just plant early wild rye. Well, if it happens to be too cold, too wet, too dry, too hot, too anything, and early wild rye doesn't do its thing, you've missed its window. It's got a short window there where it really puts on its growth and you get a lot of forage out of it. So if we, instead of just having early wild rye, we will put in other wild ryes, and they have a slightly different, it's not totally different. We're not talking about summer loving plants here. We're still back in the spring and the cool season of the year. So if we will put in those other species of wild rice, we can just, they have a saying, I think everybody from most of the states where the tall grasses grow like big blue stem has the same saying in every state, and we each think our own state is unique, and it's, you know, if you don't like the weather, wait 2 weeks and it'll change for you. And so if you wait 2 weeks and you have the early wild rye, oh, well, it wasn't quite right for it. Well, maybe it'll be just right for the jejunous wild rye, or maybe it will be just right for the Virginia wild rye. So these things come off in succession, and you're more stable if you have multiples of them in there. Another example, the native warm season grasses. So some of the native warm season grasses come off earlier in the spring. So, you know, a lot of times you're out there grazing them in May. And then other species, the 1st of June is a better time to be out there. And then other species really put on a big growth spurt up in, say, August. So If you just have one and it's dry when it's doing the biggest part of its growth, or it's too cold, or it's too wet, or in other words, the conditions are not just right, then that one species, the production of it really bombs, and you don't get good production that year. So if instead we can have multiple species, then through that whole summer, we've got different species taking on different parts of that window, and something's always just right in maturity and ready for the weather. Okay, so that is all like stability. This is how these different species really add stability to your grazing operation, to your planting. A second reason that I like to include multiple species from each functional diversity group is when we have multiple species out there, the livestock have choices of what they're going to eat. And you're like, well, I love my cows, but I don't really care if they have choices in what they're going to eat. But I would submit to you that I think it's important for the animal's health and well-being, which translates into dollars in your pocket in the end. Because if I say, here, we're going to take you to this restaurant and we're going to feed you here for the next year. Well, so you start off and you're pretty excited about, the hamburgers and French fries. That's pretty good food. But then after a couple weeks of nothing but hamburgers and French fries, you're like, gosh, this is getting a whole lot less good. And so if instead we take you to a buffet and put you there for the next year, well, you can have some, hamburger and French fry today, and the next day you can have some pizza, and well, you get bored with all of that, you can go ahead and eat some of that broccoli over there, and then you can circle back around and have yourself another hamburger. It's important for us. We like variety, and I think livestock really appreciate that too. There's a whole nother part to it, though, that there's been work done by Dr. Fred Provenza. He was at Utah State University, is now retired, but he did a lot of work with understanding how animals balance their diet, understanding how they self-medicate, so they can actually eat some of this plant to help balance the, say, tannins in this other plant. Basically, if we don't have those plants out there, of course, there's no way for those animals to self-medicate, to like balance their own diet. But if they have access to those plants, to a variety of plants, they can find different combinations that really work well for them and help solve a lot of their, dietary balance problems. There's that reason of providing variety and the medicinal impacts of the different plants in the diet. And then the third reason I think that I would include multiple species from each functional diversity group is that it really takes your soil health and your wildlife habitat to the next level. Natives are good. Just even, a monoculture of big bluestem is better for this a lot of times than a monoculture of, an introduced grass. But if you add the diversity, you really take it up. With regards to the soil health, that diversity of plants, if you think about it, that diversity of plants, there was a grassland growing here pre-settlement, and those plants, you had this diverse native grassland in effect. That's what the bison would have grazed. And that's what made our productive, healthy soils that the settlers came and they found, and they raised some really good crops on that once they had them plowed. So it really made for healthy soils. And then from the wildlife standpoint, wildlife biologists have known for a long time that diversity in our native plantings is important, and they have continued to add that diversity in those plantings. I think for these three reasons of stability to our operation as far as the grazing, the animal health and wellness that they get from having a variety of plants to eat, and then also from the soil health and wildlife benefit, I think it's a big deal that we include multiple species from each functional diversity group. The number of plants from each functional diversity group that I want varies a little bit between the functional diversity groups, because mostly some functional diversity groups have more plants to choose from than others. Native warm season grasses, let's start there. I would like to see definitely 5 species in there, and I would prefer for it to be up around 10 species or so. just because of all of those benefits you're getting from the multiple species. It lengthens out the window of growth, gives you more stability. On the native cool season grasses, very similar. For sure 5, and I'd like to see it up around 10 if you can. Okay, so then the native forbs and legumes. I often, in my mind, combine these together because, as I said, they are really, the legumes is just a subset of the forbs. I want to see at least 10 species, and I'd really like to see more like 20 species in that mix. And I like to pick the ones that are palatable unless I've got some area that I'm okay with having some less palatable ones in there. There's no problem necessarily with having those less palatable ones. In fact, I think they can be more medicinal for the animals, but they won't eat much of them. If you're worried about having non-palatable plants out there, then there's no problem with leaving those out. So I often do, when I design a mix, I just put those palatable forb species in there. And of my, say, 20 forb species, I would like to say have maybe 5 or so legumes in there. Again, there's no point, the native grasslands were really diverse. They did not just focus in on native legume species. And so there's no point in overdoing the number of legumes because our native grasslands don't need all the nitrogen that some of our introduced grasslands that we're so familiar with do. And so we don't need as much nitrogen, and while those plants were definitely a part of those native grasslands, it's not like they dominated. It's not like they were 50% of the stand or anything like that. So having 5 or so out there, a quarter or so of my species, makes me quite happy. So one last thought on functional diversity groups before we move on to adaptation. You can alter the ratio of the different functional diversity groups that you have. So you can put in more warm season grasses and less cool season grasses. You can put in more of the native cool season grasses and less of the native warm season grasses. Or maybe you want to alter the amount of the forbs and legumes that are in there, make them more or less. So reasons that you would alter the ratio of these things include, well, is this your first planting of natives? Because a lot of times having those native warm season grasses, that's really important for when you are a cool season based operation and you're doing your first native planting. Okay, so that's one consideration. Another is, well, do you have small ruminants or are you just raising cattle? I would change the composition of the mix depending upon, whether I was grazing those small ruminants or not. And then another one is, am I in full sun or do I have a silvopasture? And this brings up the next big point here, which is adaptation. Some plants are adapted to full sun. Some of them really prefer a little bit of shade, and you need to get something that's adapted to that situation. Okay, but my mind really goes heavy when we talk about adaptation to what are your soils like. And I don't mean how fertile are they. I really mean what's the wetness or dryness factor that's associated with your soils. There's a short and sweet way that we say this, and that's get the right plant in the right place. So my really obvious example that just helps you to see and understand what I'm talking about here is to talk about a cattail and a cactus. A cattail, as you're probably aware, likes to grow in swampy, boggy stuff that you don't want to drive your pickup through because you'll get it hung up most days of the year and get stuck. You've got that cattail growing down there in the swampy, boggy stuff. If you move that up to the top of a ridge, a high, dry ridge, that plant is not going to thrive for sure, and it probably won't even survive. Okay, let's take a cactus that's growing on this gravelly, high, dry ridge and plant it where the cattail came from. You might think, oh, well, more water, every plant likes more water, right? Water is good for plant growth. Well, it's true, water is good for plant growth, but that cactus will not thrive and it will not survive in that moisture environment. It's gonna just die on you. So getting the right plant in the right place is really crucial. So as you're doing a planting, become a student of your soils. Really learn what are the soils like out here. Maybe this one area is really dry, and maybe Oh, you don't want to drive through that area for a long time after a rain because that area is wetter. Those are important observations because you can do a different mix on the dry area and the wet area. Basically, you're getting that right plant in that right place and putting a focus on that. There's two keys, as I see it, to getting a good diverse native grassland planting with the purpose of grazing in mind. And those are, get the diversity out there. And you want each functional diversity group. You want multiple species in each functional diversity group for all of those reasons that we discussed before. And then the other one is get the right plant in the right place. Get plants that are adapted. Really pay attention to your soils and also the shade, the amount of shade you do or don't have. If you want to go deeper with the concept of what to plant in a diverse native grassland, maybe you've got a certain situation that you're looking at, thinking about what would I plant here, get with us. Give us a holler, shoot us an email. We'd be happy to talk with you, correspond with you either way about what to plant in that area, share thoughts about, you know, how to read your soils for wetness, all of these things. So give us a holler and we'd love to chat with you.